There are a ton of fun new commanders coming out of Zendikar Rising. 4-color Omnath, absorbing another slice of the colour pie, a Mega Crab with the nicest butt of magic, and even a Boros commander with card draw. But everyone's going to be talking about those. Instead today, I want to talk about a merfolk named Xaroth Tharn the Trickster. Xaroth looks like a ton of fun, even with a budget build, as we can take advantage of his ability to build a powerful board state from our opponent's cards. This deck was built to a $100 budget based on the Card Kingdom values and Architect. If you buy elsewhere and don't mind getting played cards, this deck can be built for a lot less. Let's get into it. What does Xaroth do? Xaroth is a 5-mana commander, costing 1 blue, 1 black, and 3 generic. He has Flash, and whenever he deals combat damage to a player, you can put a permanent from their graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. Considering how many graveyard-based decks are in the format, this is a pretty sweet ability that can steal some serious power from our opponents. But that's not all. Like getting a new set of Stake Knives with your purchase, Xaroth also comes with a ninjutsu-like ability. Whenever a rogue you control attacks and isn't blocked, if you have Xaroth in your hand, you can pay 2 generic and a blue and a black to return that rogue to your hand and put Xaroth into play, tapped and attacking. So, how have I built this deck? A bit of unblockable rogues, some clone effects, and a bunch of mill effects to fuel targets for Xaroth. Let's get into it. Starting with the basics, let's go over the ramp, removal, and draw options in the deck, before we get into the nitty-gritty of cards that specifically help Xaroth. As we are in Dimir, our ramp is mostly artifact-based. We have Sol Ring, Prismatic Lens, Star Compass, Commander Sphere, Darksteel Ingot, Dimir Cluestone, and Dimir Locket for our basic mana rocks. Dimir Signet and Wayfarer's Bauble were cut due to cost, but they would be obviously included in the deck. We also have Dowsing Dagger for ramp. With all the unblockable rogues, this should be fairly easy to flip over into a 3-mana land. And lastly, a Myriad Landscape because it's just a good ramping land, with only a minor downside of coming in tapped. Our removal package is also fairly straightforward, with a Curse of the Swine to exile things, Crux of Fate, Devastation Tide, and Flood of Tears as our board wipes. We kinda want to get Xaroth back into hand, so these bounce wipes aren't too bad for us. And when building on a budget in Dimir, it's a bunch you have to work with. Then for targeted removal, we have Pongify, Doomblade, Go for the Throat, Counterspell, Negate, and the brand new Feed the Swarm, which gives us a way to interact with enchantments in blue and black. This is a pretty standard budget removal package in my opinion. Feel free to swap out cards like Go for the Throat and Doomblade if they don't really fit your meta. Now for the card advantage. Our commander is an advantage engine himself, so I'm going to stick to the direct card draw in this section. Read the Bones, Siphon Mind, and Treasure Cruise are our direct draw spells, along with Windfall and Whispering Madness for group wheel effects. These wheels also power our graveyard stealing, so they're really good for both drawing cards and getting targets. Since we have a bunch of unblockable rogues, we have Bident of Thassa and Mask of Riddles to make them draw cards when they hit, along with a new Ghostly Pilferer to draw whenever our opponents cast things not in their hands, like their commander. There are also many creatures in this deck that steal cards when they hit, but we'll leave them for the later section. This deck doesn't really self-mill much, but we still need ways to get stuff back from our graveyard. For that, we've got Phyrexian Reclamation to return creatures to hand, and an Archaeomancer to return a sorcery or instant spell. Like I said, pretty light, but that's because we aren't putting things into our graveyard. No, we're going to steal things from other people's graveyards. So, how are we going to do that? Well, first we need to fill our opponent's graveyards with cards, so some mill is required. And I must say, I really like that mill is now a keyword. It's really good to have it named correctly. As mentioned earlier, we have 2 wheel effects with Windfall and Whispering Madness, but we also have Traumatize for milling a ton of cards at once. We have Memory Erosion and Psychic Corrosion from repeating mill effects, both good for slowly putting cards into the graveyard as the game continues. We have a Mind Crank in the deck so our opponents can help mill each other with damage, and depending on the power of your playgroup, they could end up milling themselves by playing life. Lastly, we have a Trepanation Blade that mills whenever their creature attacks. Sometimes it's great, other times it'll just hit a land immediately, but it's always good to have a bit of chance in the game. This doesn't seem like a lot of mill, however we don't want to actually win through milling, so this is fine. Cards will end up in the graveyard regardless of what we're doing, so we just need to have enough to have some targets for our commander. How are we actually getting our commander through? Since Xaroth's ability only works from hand, we don't want to leave him high and dry when he's on the battlefield. So we have a few ways to sneak him behind enemy lines. First up is Whispercell Cloak, which gives us both Shroud and Unblockable, very nice for a commander. Then we have Prowler's Helm, which gives unblockable except by walls, which should be good enough unless you're playing an Arcades deck or something, but you don't want their stupid defenders anyway, so it's fine. We have a Trailblazer's Boots, which gives non-basic land walk, and nearly everyone plays non-basics in Commander, so it's basically unblockable. And lastly, we have Fleet Feather Sandals for haste and flying. I was split on whether to run the sandals or Swiftfoot boots and decided on the extra evasion, but Swiftfoot boots would be an equally good choice here if you're worried about targeted removal. The real power of Xerath is in his ability to sneak into play from your hand, but since he starts in the command zone, we need some workarounds to actually get him into hand. First up, we have the fairly recent Netherborn Altar to put Xerath directly into hand. This is a pretty good card as it allows us to get around Xerath's attacks and get him into play for 4 mana instead of 5. Once he's in play, we can also bounce him back to hand with Crystal Shard, Cavern Harpy, or Fairy Imposter. Crystal Shard allows us to do this multiple times at an instant speed, and the Harpy can be bounced back to hand for multiple uses. The Fairy is also a rogue with flying, which helps the rest of the deck. Lastly, we have Cunning Evasion, which allows us to bounce any creature that becomes blocked. So if we want to get Xerath back to hand, we can simply attack and let our opponent either choose to block and let us bounce him, or hit something and steal from their graveyard. With enough mana, we could even set up a no-win scenario where if we swing him with Xerath and bounce him to hand, we can replay him again with his ability and still get the hit in. Ideally, we don't need too much bounce to make Xerath work, just enough to dodge from removal and use his ability occasionally. Once he's out, we mainly want to just let him hit our opponents when we can. On that topic, however, let's talk about the rogues we are using Xerath's ability with. We want rogues that are both evasive and provide some advantage. Now, your first instinct may be to just jam the deck full of unblockable rogues, but we need our rogues to actually do something other than just swing for 1 damage. The list I've put together is Fairy Imposter, who can fly and bounce Xerath, Murfolk Spy that has Island Walk and reveals cards, Blighted Agent, which is unblockable and has Infect, Ghostly Pilferer, which can be made unblockable and draws us cards, Invisible Stalker, who is unblockable and hard to remove with Hexproof, Looter Ilkor, which has Shadow and can loot on hit, Soaring Thoughts Thief that has flying and mills opponents, and Meringue River Prowler, who is unblockable and can be cast from the graveyard. Now you might ask, why is unblockable not as important? Because of an important phrase missing from Xerath's ability. Unlike Ninjutsu, you do not have to put Xerath into play attacking the same player that the returned creature was. For example, let's say that player 3 here has a nice juicy Eldrazi in their graveyard, but they're a green-black deck, so our Murfolk Spy, who has an Island Walk, can't swing at them. However, player B is playing mono blue, so we swing our Spy at them. Then, after blocks, we use Xerath's ability to bounce the Spy to our hand, but we put Xerath into play attacking the green-black player. Because it's after blocks, they can't block Xerath, and he can hit them and steal their Eldrazi. Since we are running all these evasive creatures, it's also worth putting a bunch of the traditional ninjas into the deck. The 2 I ended up choosing was Fallen Shinobi, which allows us to play cards from the top of an opponent's library when it hits, Silent Blade Oni, which allows us to play cards from their hand. These are basically value pieces for the deck that work well with the strategy that our fake Zendikar ninja wants. Onto our other clone and steal effects, the real power of the deck. Thief of Sanity allows us to both mill and steal cards from our opponents that we can then play. Evil Twin, Clone, and Vizier of Many Faces allows us to have a copy of the biggest threat on the board. Garuda, Doom of the Depths, provides both mill and a second way to steal creatures from our opponent's graveyards. Rexiel, the Risen Deeps, allows us to steal sorcery and instant spells from graveyards, which Xerath can't actually get. We also have a Gonti, Lord of Luxury, who can steal a spell from the top of the library, and he also doubles as a Death Touch Rogue, allowing us to swing and bounce him for multiple casts. Outside of the creatures, we have a Psychic Possession, because if we're going to borrow their cards, we might as well also borrow their draw steps. Just remember, always put it on the blue player and not the mono white player. Lastly, we have a Memory Plunder to cast a spell out of someone's graveyard, just a fine utility spell for the deck, which fits our theme of filling graveyards. Let's go over the land base. It's a pretty standard budget demand mana base, so we'll do this quite quickly. We've got a Bojuka Bog for dealing with problem graveyards. Yes, we don't really want to exile people's graveyards very often, but sometimes you're playing with a Muldrotha and you just can't let them have a full graveyard. Then we've got Temple of Deceit, Dimir Aqueduct, and Command Tower for our dual lands, the 2 single mana cycling lands, then Mystic Sanctuary and Witch's Cottage for a bit of extra graveyard recursion, and lastly a Tectonic Edge and a Ghostly Quarter for land removal. I always recommend a little bit of targeted land removal because you never know when you have to stop someone with a Gaia's Cradle or a Cabal Coffers. On top of that, we have 12 basic islands and 9 basic swamps, since the deck is weighted more towards blue than black. With the bulk of the deck covered, let's talk about how it wins. We do have some infinite mill combos in the deck, so let's talk about them first. Since we're running Mindcrank, it makes sense to include both Duskmantle Guildmage and Sir Conrad the Grim, who both combo off with it. Duskmantle is an infinite damage combo Though, if a player has a lot more life, they may run out of cards before they die, but at that point their library is also empty, so passing the turn to them should win the game. The Conrad loop isn't infinite, but in a 4-player game it will normally kill most of the table, or at least leave 1 or 2 players with very little life. The way it works is that with each creature that goes into the graveyard, Conrad deals a damage to each player. This then triggers the Mind Crank. This can then stack if multiple creatures are milled at once from different players. However, if all players manage to avoid hitting creatures and all the mill triggers happen, the loop does stop. However, as soon as any point of damage is done again, it starts all over again. It can take some time to resolve, but it nearly always kills the table. The other combo in the deck is Blighted Agent and Bone Horde. It won't take long for Bone Horde to have enough creatures in graveyard to turn something like a Blighted Agent into a one-hit kill. Though, keeping a Blighted Agent on the board long enough to actually hit someone can sometimes be hard. In a really long game, you may even be able to put Bone Horde on Zareth for a commander damage kill. Other than those combos, our main way to win will simply be stealing the best spells and cards from our opponent's graveyards. This means our deck should scale fairly well between different power levels, as we are using our opponent's strengths against them. It's not until you get up into higher power levels where infinite combos and heavy interaction happen that will leave our deck behind. In terms of power ranking, I'd personally rate this about a 6 on the power scale. We have an infinite combo, however no tutors, and we are completely reliant on other players' decks to make our big plays. Overall, I think this is a really fun deck concept for those looking for a theft deck without the bad feels of actually stealing from the battlefield. So, that's the deck, but there are a few cards I want to mention that didn't quite make the cut, either for power or cost or a bunch of other reasons. So, let's go over them. In regards to power, I didn't include Narset Parter of Veils or Notion Thief. That combo really well with our wheel effects. Playing that sort of combo is much stronger than the casual power ranking I wanted for this, and often results in bad feels for other players. But if you want to pump up the deck's power, these are some really powerful choices to do. Not only will it completely destroy their hands if you cast a wheel with them out, but it stops them from drawing many cards. Some of the other ninjas could also be added to the deck, such as Ink Eyes, who can ninjutsu to steal a creature from a graveyard like Zareth. There's also Throat Slitter, who can enter to kill something, great for repeatable removal if we can keep bouncing him. Sword of the Animus is also an obvious upgrade for the deck. With our unblockable creatures, this should be able to ramp multiple times in a game if dropped early. It didn't make the cut for cost reasons, being about $7 or $8, but is a perfect include if you have a spare one. Lastly is a cool land that was left out of the budget for cost reasons. Sinzu Death Storehouse is an untapped black source that can give a legendary creature fear, perfect for swinging in with our commander. If you've got one lying around, this is a great deck to include it in, but it is quite expensive. Well, that's everything from me for this deck tech. Hope you've enjoyed this, thanks for watching, and good night. I'll then tap 7 for the only 7 drop in my deck.
And response.
Alright, you got the card response?
Pay 1. 2. Tap one of my artifacts for its improvised cost. Pay 3 more mana.
I'm playing 3 more mana.
Yep.
Card is dead.